Genesis 24, and if you will notice, you actually, well, in my Bible anyway, you have to turn a couple of pages to get to the end of the chapter. It has 67 verses, but much of it is repetition, so I'm not going to be reading that whole chapter, and we're going to be reading from it as we move along in the text this morning. The providence of God in generational promise keeping, and I hope you'll see why I called it that as we move through the text this morning. This is a new phase of life for everyone involved in the life of Abraham, but we need to remember that it is still being lived in the ordinary. In the ordinary. Life still moves along its guided path. People are still being born, and they are still dying. Servants age just like anyone else, and Abraham is getting older. Meals still need to be prepared. Cattle and sheep and the other animals still need to be fed and cared for and tended. At this point in time, Sarah has been dead 3 years. 3 years. 127. The only woman in the Bible to be told what age she was when she passed. The household servants have had to step up, not only to take care of her in her dying days, but to run the household in her absence. And of course, Abraham is still the master of the house. He's still the sheik of the sheikdom. And Isaac is coming into his own. We can be assured that more and more responsibilities were being given to him, and I have to think that he was eagerly accepting any and all challenges. God had not spoken to Abraham since the test in which God proved Abraham, and that was about 25 to 30 years ago from the point in time that we're speaking of this morning. So in total, they have been in the land 65 years. 65 years. Through that time, God has set forth some basic promises, hasn't he? Do you remember those? After the Lord tells Abraham to leave everything behind, he sets forth his multifaceted promise to Abraham. The Lord will make him a great nation. The Lord will bless him. The Lord will make his name great. The Lord promises protection. And the most important of all, he promises that in him all the families of the earth will be blessed. And when God says that all the families of the earth will be blessed, you can count on it. With the promise of God ingrained in his life, Abraham had witnessed much of what God had said come to fruition. He had been protected, and his name was being made great. Remember, negotiating for the gravesite for Sarah? You are the Prince of God among us, a great Prince of God among us. His name was being made great. We have seen how the promise of God hinged on the birth of Isaac. This part of the promise, too, came to fruition. However, if the nations are going to be blessed, right? If the nations are going to be blessed and a nation is to be formed, something else has to happen. Something else has to transpire. Isaac needs a bride, so that he may marry and have children. We have already talked about how God said to Abraham he would be God to him and to his seed after him, right? This is a generational promise. It is a generational promise. And at this point in time, we have not heard a word from God as to how Abraham is to proceed. However, we were alerted to Abraham finding out about the welfare of his brother and the children and grandchildren that he had. We saw this at the end of Genesis chapter 22. But now, as the text says, Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham is now 140 years of age, and Isaac is 40. However else it may have transpired, Abraham discerns it was time to provide a wife for Isaac. This is a long text before us with nuance and repetition with which we want to interact. And so we come to how God will guide. God will guide. In order to have the potential for the most success, Abraham instructs his servant. Possibly Eliezer, we met him earlier on when he told the Lord, "May Eliezer live before you." He's the oldest. He was the oldest in the household. He was his main man, his right-hand man. But now he has a son, and now he instructs him as to what to do. He was to place his hand under Abraham's thigh and swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live, but you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. Aside from a few alliances that Abraham had made while in the land of promise, the Canaanites are an idolatrous group of people, worshiping other gods. This Abraham could not abide, and neither can we. We are called to be equally yoked, united in like faith. So for Abraham, it was not to be through the sons of Ham, but Shem, that he would seek to find a wife for Isaac. We remember the words of Noah in this regard when Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan, the son of Ham." Cursed be Canaan. So it has to be outside of that line that Isaac finds a wife. There's some tension that builds at this point. The servant is concerned that the woman may not want to come back with him to the land of promise. What if she will not return with me? Does Isaac go to her at that point? Abraham is emphatic at this point when he says, "Beware that you do not take my son back there, outside of the land of promise." It is here where we find the providence of God put on display for the reader by what Abraham says next. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and who swore to me, saying, 'To your seed I will give this land,' he will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there." Remember, God was not speaking at this moment to Abraham. Abraham has matured in the faith. He has developed wisdom, discernment, and understanding. He is able to make decisions, therefore. Just like as you get older, you're no longer a child, and you have to make decisions for yourself. Abraham matured spiritually. He's able to make these kinds of decisions without having to have specific guidance each step of the way. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. The Lord our God continues to develop his people in this way even today. The more we come to understand God's sovereignty and direction of history according to his purposes, we are better able to confidently approach the future. So no matter what it looks like in terms of the world, we are able to better confidently look at the future and anticipate the future because of our God. Because of our God. And this is the confidence of Abraham in God. Nevertheless, he leaves room for God's working or nullifying his own plans. God is sovereign. He can do that. So he adds Remember the concern. What if she doesn't want to come back? If the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this my oath. Only do not take my son back there. Then the servant swears to it. And so we come to God granting success. At that, it is time for the servant to set off on his task. We get a glimpse of Abraham's wealth as he packs 10 camels with a variety of good things, the text says. He didn't go by himself. He also took with him various other servants. Abraham had been blessed of the Lord indeed. So these were servants that were able to go, leaving others behind to continue to take care of all the animals and everything else. And these are able to set off. And he travels to his brother's house. The text says in Nahor, or Haran, which is nearby. It's about 450 miles one way. He plans his course of action, and he begins to implement it. Here is where we find the second instance of trust in God and in his providential care. Look at what the servant prays in Genesis 24:12 through 14. O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show loving kindness, hesed, to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the girl to whom I say, please let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, drink, and I will water your camels also, may she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant, Isaac. And by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness, hesed, to my master. Notice the appeal to the sovereign God. It is no small thing that the servant is asking. Abraham said that God would send his angel, right? And the servant is counting on that to be the case. Trusting in God's sovereignty does not mean, however, that you do nothing. Rather, it means you take action because you believe God is sovereign. You act in righteousness. You follow him actively. It means that you load up the camels with goods and you set off on your journey. It means that you pray. You intercede in prayer. It means that you engage with the world around you. Notice also that his prayer is bathed in loving kindness, or chesed. There is nothing wrong with appealing to God's character in prayer. In fact, I find myself doing that more and more. Remember the 3 appeals when praying. As we pray, we make appeal in God's name, referring to his character, or the promise that flows from his character, or in terms of the purpose of God being fulfilled in his people. This appeal by Abraham's servant addresses all 3 of these. And that is a good thing. That's something we ought to follow in acknowledging him. This type of praying is not for God's benefit. He knows who he is. He knows what his purposes are. But the benefit is for us. It is a reminder to us that God is God alone, and that we are dependent upon him for all things. One of the things that the world tries to do, beloved, one of the things that it tries to do is bend reality to its own will. The creature thinks he is God, and he tries to bring reality into a different sphere of existence, but he cannot do it because he is dependent upon him for all things. What happens? The text is clear that before he had finished speaking, before his prayer was even done, Rebekah had come down with her jar on her shoulder. She was a pure woman, the text says, a virgin and the grandchild of Abraham's brother Nahor. The servant asks for a drink, and she gladly lowers the jar to give him a drink. But beyond that, she offers to draw for his camels. Do you know how much camels drink at one time? I looked it up. Minimally, they can drink 20 gallons in one sitting. Just 20 gallons times 10. How much water did she draw? At least 200, if not more. She was quite the woman. I would be hard-pressed to want to draw that much water for the camels. Right? And this is exactly what the servant had prayed. May it be that the woman who does such and such, may she be the one. Can you give me a drink? Sure, let me water your camels also. It was coming to fruition right before his eyes. However, he watches carefully as the events unfolds. The text says, to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. The servant then confirms everything that he suspected to be the case concerning Rebekah. The servant's response to everything that Rebekah had told him, the servant bowed low and worshiped the Lord. Right there at the well, in front of God and everybody, he didn't care. He was going to give God his due, saying, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers. Worship, beloved, worship is the right response to the activity of God in our lives. Worship is the right response to the activity of God in our lives. That ought to be like breathing. It ought to reach the point where you don't even have to think about it. Where something transpires, good or ill, and you're able to give thanks to God and worship him. I worship you, Lord, because I know you are in control. Your purposes will be fulfilled, even if I can't see it, and even if it appears things are against me. I may trust in you. It is giving God his due for what he has accomplished in us for his glory. And again, we find the reliance upon God's providence, but also his loving kindness toward his people. Remember God's name. Part of what we have said in quoting from Exodus 34 is that God, what? Abounds in loving kindness and faithfulness or truth, and he keeps loving kindness. He keeps his loving kindness, and he kept his loving kindness for Abraham, and he will for you as well. That's why the exhortation all the time, trust in him, rely on him. Place your hope and confidence in him. So God's character is applied to the fulfillment of his purposes. And then God works in the family. This is just the first step, in a way. Well, second step. He travels, he gets there, he prays, Rebekah shows up. Second step, he's saying, this is coming together, but she has a family. Once again, relying on God's providence does not preclude taking the necessary steps to reach one's goal. It is important that we understand this. In light of this, Rebekah runs to her mother's household and tells them about these things. Her brother Laban then, whom we would meet later with Jacob, if you remember that, sees the ring and the bracelets on his sister's wrists. Remember what we said about brothers. Yeah. What? You've gone to the well how many times and now you come back with ring and bracelets? What is the deal? He's the brother. He's got to safeguard his sister. He's got to find out what's going on. But he listens carefully to what Rebekah had to say about the situation, and he begins then to take action. He makes sure that the house is prepared to receive the servant of Abraham and the servants that came with him, and he also has a place for the camels. And he makes sure that the camels have plenty to eat. I didn't look that up. I looked up the water. I'm sure they eat a lot too. He makes sure that these visitors are well tended to by providing water to wash their feet, both the servant of Abraham and the men who are with him. Everything is set. Food had been prepared and food is set before them. But the servant refuses to eat. He refuses to eat until he has shared what brought him there in the first place. The servant then begins to recount everything that brought him to this place. He begins by identifying himself as Abraham's servant. He speaks of the blessing of God upon the life of Abraham. He had blessed him greatly with flocks and herds and silver and gold and servants and maids and camels and donkeys, and on I think it could go. He recounts how God had opened Sarah's womb to bear a son to Abraham in her old age, and how he had given Isaac everything. And then he recounts Abraham's charge in finding a wife, and coming to the well and finding Rebekah. Everything that he had asked of the Lord came to pass. So with God's call upon the life of Abraham, he blessed him as he said he would. He granted loving kindness to Abraham. He grants you loving kindness. He sets his love upon you as you called upon his name. He sets his love upon you. And it did not depart from Abraham, and it will not depart from you. He had made his way successful, and thus far he had made the way of his servant successful. God had definitely been at work providentially in this situation. We don't see him speaking, but we see him at work. Now comes the decision of the family. I know what I would tend to want to say if somebody just met my daughter and wanted to carry her off. Would they approve of Rebekah going with the servant to become Isaac's wife? The response of Laban and her father Bethuel was clear. The matter comes from the Lord, so we cannot speak to you bad or good. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. God had successfully and providentially prepared the hearts of Rebekah's family. And finally, God unites. As we begin to see how God unites Isaac and Rebekah together, we look at some of the responses. Abraham's servant once again, throughout this whole passage, he once again bows himself before the Lord in worship. The food is there, he can smell it, he's taking care of God's will, of the business of the Lord, and he worships once again. He does not concern himself with those around him, and he gives due glory to God. The Lord had made his way successful. The Lord had demonstrated once again his loving kindness toward Abraham. Once he finishes his worship, he brings forth gifts for Rebekah and her brother and her mother. He brought forth articles of silver and articles of gold and garments. It was at this point the servant and the men with him then, once the business is all taken care of, they sit down, they drank, they ate, and they spent the night. Once morning dawns, the servant and his men want to set off on their way with Rebekah. It's quite the turnaround. However, the suddenness of this departure does not sit very well with the family. They want Rebekah to spend at least another 10 days. Let her, this is so sudden. Let her spend another, say 10 days with the family. And then she can go. The servant once again makes an appeal to God's providence. He says, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master." However, far from making Rebekah do something she does not want to do, I want you to get that. They didn't bind her up and tell her, "You must go." They consult her wishes. They talk to her. Imagine that. They asked her point blank, "Will you go with this man? You know what lies ahead if you do. Will you go?" In a marriage ceremony, what do we ask? It's important that we ask these questions. You may think, what do they mean? We're right here. Will you have this woman? Will you have this man? You really can say no at that point. You'd have to deal with the consequences, but you really could. And it should be okay. It should be okay at that point even. Will you go with this man, Rebekah? Will you go? And she responded, "I will go." With everything set, they pronounce the blessing. The family blessed her by saying, "May you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them." Does that sound familiar? It should. Something that God had spoken to Abraham previously. And the blessing now is being repeated in Isaac and Rebekah's new union. Now we've become generational in our thinking here. A lot of time has passed, 40 years from the birth of Isaac till now. But it's generational, you see. It's generational, and we need to be generational in our thinking. The multiplying of seed first came to Abraham and Sarah, and now falls to Isaac and Rebekah. And now the seed of Isaac and Rebekah will possess the gate of his enemies. Same blessing. Same one that came to Abraham after he was ready to sacrifice Isaac, and now that same blessing is pronounced here. God has been God to Abraham and Sarah. What was his promise to them back in Genesis 17 when he gave him the rite of circumcision? "I will be God to you and to your seed after you." God has been God to Abraham and Sarah, and now he is God to Isaac and Rebekah. And he has promised to be God to their seed as well. You see how the promise of God continues? Each generation. There's always a remnant. There's always a remnant. We need to remember that. Like Sarah, the blessing of multiplication comes to Rebekah. With that, they loaded up the camels as well as Rebekah along with her maids. And they headed back to the land of promise. Well, what about Isaac? Isaac, which must have been his regular practice, was out in the field meditating. Perhaps he was thinking about the faithfulness of God. Perhaps he was thinking about everything that Abraham had taught him concerning God Most High and his faithfulness to his covenant promise. Maybe he was thinking about the promise of God in regard to a people being formed for his own name. Whatever it might have been that he had been meditating upon, he noticed then the caravan of camels coming toward him. Rebekah saw this man and dismounted from her camel. She asked the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" The servant rightly responds that this man is my master. Remember, Abraham gave everything to Isaac. Everything. Rebekah covers herself, the veil, right? The servant tells Isaac all that God had done and accomplished. Notice that. All that God had done and accomplished. Well, wasn't it the servant who said all these things and did all these things? Well, it was God, and in his providence. God had done this. God had made his way prosperous in his providence to secure the blessings to future generations. If Isaac didn't get a bride, there would be no future generations. Understand this. Understand this. Isaac received Rebekah, and she became his wife. The text says, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Rebekah then takes Sarah's place. She is now the matriarch of the family. And so God demonstrates that in his providence, he is able to secure his blessings to future generations. With all the hindrances, with all the question marks, with all the I don't knows that are out there. That does not hinder God in any way. That does not hinder God from fulfilling his word. As we wrap up our thoughts for today, with this, God's promise for future generations has been demonstrated to be secured. To be secured. God will do what he says he will do. We are glad for God's providence. At least we ought to be. The older I get, I am so much more appreciative of the providence of God. We have said before that God is not hands-off when it comes to his creation or his creatures. And we embrace that. God is involved. God's promise of life and forgiveness of sins will continue to be upheld, and his purposes will be fulfilled. And rest hard on that promise, beloved. Trust in our God to carry you throughout all the days of your life, every single one of your moments, because his loving kindness he has promised will not depart. You see, let that carry you. Let that encourage you. Let that uphold you and strengthen you. Abraham has been tested, tried, and proved. We used to say, I've been put through the ringer. Abraham was put through the proverbial ringer. God has been faithful to what he promised Abraham. He rested in his God and trusted in him and his faithfulness to accomplish his promises. And we are glad he did. What else is left? We find out next time. Father, we thank you for your word of promise. We thank you for your loving kindness, for your promise-keeping throughout the generations, and how in your providence it comes to pass. We bow and worship in response to what you have accomplished in these past days, in these ancient times. And we worship you. you alone who are God and who is our God. And in the same way that Abraham trusted in you, and Isaac trusted in you, and the servant of Abraham trusted in you, and in your loving kindness, so do we. And we trust that through all the ups and downs that we have yet to encounter, you will continue to carry us, and that we will continue to know your loving kindness, which will not depart. And we give you glory and praise through Christ. Amen.